Welcome to the Power Food Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Kristy Jo, mind and body strategist. You're listening to episode number 240, Reversing Type 2 Diabetes with Dr. Gurpreet Padda. I'm passionate about helping you learn how to become a strategist of your own health and body using science-backed evidence, anecdotal principles proven effective in my coaching, and psychological awareness. Be sure to hit that subscribe button to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. Visit me on Instagram at Power Foods Lifestyle and learn more about my coaching services at powerfoodslifestyle.com. Okay, PFL champs, I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Padda to you. He is a medical physician board certified in anesthesiology, addiction, and interventional pain. For over 20 years, he has been practicing in the urban core, helping his patients regain their metabolic health. Pain is the final pathway, the body screaming that something has gone terribly wrong. Dr. Padda treats clinical patients at the intersection of the pain epidemic, opioid epidemic, and the diabetes epidemic. They are all interrelated pathologies, the clinical manifestations of systemic meta-inflammation. PFL champs, you are in for such a treat to hear his discussion today, talking about how to reverse type 2 diabetes, that it's completely possible. Some of my favorite quotes from our interview are, firstly, all diets will have you lose weight. There is no doubt about it. You can lose weight following any of these approaches. You have to back up and say, look, what's going on? Dr. Padda is going to discuss how the liver and glycogen storage has a finite amount, how fat actually accumulates in the body, and how the gut bacteria have a huge role in that. He says that about 99% of the DNA in our body is from that gut bacteria. Dr. Padda is going to discuss a recent study that shows us that sugar addiction can actually be a thing, but he says there's more to it, and he's going to expound on that. It's quite interesting. I really enjoyed talking with him and can't wait to share this with you. I think at the end of this, you're going to feel more motivated to think about your food intake. Think about those little lifestyle habits that you are currently doing that impact your health and your weight. We have so much power when we take our own body and health into our hands, when we seek to become strategists who think about all the little players in our day, the way that our nutrition, our fitness, our sleep, our mindset, all those little habits, how they add up to reach our cumulative whole. So I'm not going to make you wait any longer. Here is the interview with Dr. Gurpreet Padda. Dr. Padda, we are so grateful that you're joining us on the Power Food Lifestyle podcast today.
Awesome.
I would love to dive right into asking you how metabolism works, because it seems like many of us don't understand the full science of what actually happens. It's like this mystery, and it seems that you know so much about what happens with our glycogen that you can explain and help us understand. Would you like to start there?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best place to start. You can lose weight in a variety of ways. There's a million ways that you can lose weight. But when I talk to patients, I want them to lose weight in a way, or to be at a healthy weight. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to lose weight, but to be at a healthy weight that's appropriate and to have a healthy amount of muscle. Muscle is the organ of longevity. The more muscle you have, the longer you're going to live. And if you don't have muscle, your chances of dying early go way up. So muscle is the organ of longevity. Everything else in your body goes along with that. And when we look at weight, most people look at fat, and they go, well, I'm carrying all this weight. I've got all this fat. And there's people that conjecture, oh, I should eat a high-carb diet and a low-fat diet. I should eat a low-carb diet and a high-fat diet. I should eat a high-protein diet and a low fat. And people conjecture back and forth. And all diets will have you lose weight. There's no doubt about it. You can lose weight on a high carb. You can lose weight on a high protein. You can lose weight on a high fat.
I love that you say that.
and so you have to back up and say, okay, look, what's going on? What's going on? I mean, what do I need to understand about the underpinnings of this? And I think one of the things that we have to understand is that when you consume carbohydrates, which is starches or unrefined carbohydrates or carbohydrates, whatever they are, the starch breaks down into glucose and fructose. Glucose generates energy, it generates your ATP, and excessive glucose is converted to glycogen and it's stored. It works at that storage through the process of insulin. Insulin allows the cells to take up the glucose, the majority of cells in your body, not all of them, but the majority. So insulin is there to help glucose enter the cell. Insulin has another action, though. Insulin also causes storage of fat. And so insulin allows your body to take up the glucose, and if your body gets too much glucose, it starts to store it as fat. Your body can only handle about 500 grams of glycogen storage. And glycogen storage is typically in your liver, and it's there as an emergency fuel source if you went into acute starvation. If you were a Paleolithic ancestral human and all of a sudden for a couple of days you couldn't eat, you would dip into your glycogen reserve first, and then you would dip into your fat reserve. And that's what allows us to survive. As modern humans, though, we never really dip into our glycogen reserves because we're constantly fed all the time. So we live at nearly a 500-gram full glycogen status. And basically anything that we eat as modern humans immediately dumps into fat. Because as soon as we get a little bit of insulin, our glycogen reserve is full, we can't overpack it, and everything else overflows to fat. So once we get that concept that glycogen has about a 500-gram reserve, which is 2,000 calories roughly, or so. And
of carbohydrate, you're saying?
Yeah. And glycogen is a carbohydrate reserve. That you have very limited carbohydrate reserves. You have unlimited, practically, fat reserves.
I just love to clarify, because you said 500 grams of glycogen. So what does that look like in terms of, do we know how many grams of carbohydrates that is? If you're saying it's about 2,000 calories, are you saying, because there's 4 calories per gram, so are we saying that that's about 500 grams of carbs?
Yeah, but see, the carbs that you eat are not with the carbs that your body stores, because there's a loss of carbohydrate and general stuff that happens in your gut and in your intestines with the bacteria that live there. So there's an inefficiency of what you eat to what actually gets in your body, into your bloodstream and into your liver. And so there's an inefficiency. But what is efficiently absorbed is about 500 grams, and that's what you can efficiently store. Depending upon your personal gut bacteria, you might be able to take in double that and only get 500 grams of storage. And that's why weight loss is so complicated, because we have these gut bacteria that are living within our intestines, and they determine what gets stored and what doesn't get stored, what comes into our bloodstream, what doesn't come into our bloodstream. They themselves burn energy. They have to survive. Most of our DNA in our body is actually these gut bacteria. 99% of all of the DNA in our body is probably our gut bacteria. Mm-hmm. We're really like big hosts for these parasites. And these parasites need the carbohydrates too. They need the fatty acids. They need all these macronutrients. And so but in the pure science of it, 500 grams is what your liver can handle. That doesn't mean that you took in 500 grams to get that. You might have taken in 1,000 grams to get to that 500.
I see.
It depends on the efficiency level of your body. And in human systems, the more efficient you are at taking in these carbohydrates or proteins or fats, the more you're going to weigh. So in actuality, the less efficient you are, the leaner you're going to be. We're designed from an ancestral period, from a Paleolithic period, to be pretty efficient. And that historical high level of efficiency is what drives us to become overweight once we have full access to all the nutrition that we want. And so back to this 500 grams. Now, about 500 grams you can store. Anything over that goes to fat. The reason why we get so rapidly fat in modern culture and overflow to fat so quickly is because we never deplete that 500 grams. We're living at that 500-gram fullness. Intermittent fasting is a tool that depletes into that 500 grams. Ketogenic diets are a tool that deplete into that 500 grams. Even particular caloric restriction with fat, even particular caloric restriction with protein, anything that you can do to dip into that 500-gram reserve starts pulling the fat out of your fat cells. And so once you understand that you have to excursion in and out of that 500 grams, and anything over that's going to flow over, then you can kind of play with the model and see how you're going to bring your weight down. And I'll send you a graphic on this because I know it sounds complicated, but it's not that complicated. But this explains why when you eat sugar, you end up gaining fat because you're already full with your glycogen reserve, and it overflows to fat because of the insulin. And so innately, we would think you eat sugar, it should go to sugar. You eat fat, it should go to fat. But for most Americans, most people with the American diet eat sugar, their glycogen reserve is full, and they overflow immediately to fat. So sugar converts to fat that way.
Interesting. So I'm curious about two little caveats on that, just to better dive in, and I'm genuinely curious too. So if, let's say, someone's glycogen was completely depleted, maybe they had been doing a ketogenic approach for maybe 2 months or so, and then they go back suddenly to eating a lot of sugar. Assuming it was not enough to top out that glycogen tank, would it be safe to say that that person, if they gain weight on the scale, has not actually put on body fat? Because I know that metabolic flexibility switch can be a little bit tricky going from fat burning efficiency in a ketogenic approach to glucose burning. And that's been a big fear of a lot of people when they suddenly go back to eating carbs, that, oh no, I'm going to gain all this weight. Is it only if they don't control the carb intake? What's your thoughts there?
Exactly. So there's a concept called insulin resistance, which is typically thought of as pre-diabetes, where you become insulin resistant. But what you're describing is something called physiologic insulin resistance. So if you've been on a prolonged period of ketogenic diet, you become physiologically insulin resistant. And for about 2 to 3 days after you come off of your ketosis period, you're going to be slightly insulin resistant, but you're going to go back completely to normal. Your receptors are going to function perfectly normal. You will not gain a bunch of fat as long as you continue to excursion into your 500 grams of glycogen reserve. Now, glycogen has a little bit of weight because it's got a lot of water. It's got a lot of electrolytes. And so 500 grams of glycogen carries probably another kilo, another 2 or 3 pounds of water with it. And so you'll immediately start to gain some of that water weight. And your gut bacteria also carry a bunch of water. And so you might gain 6, 7, 8, 9 pounds of water weight in your intestines. That doesn't mean that you gain fat. And it's the same thing on the other side. When you go onto a diet, people typically will lose between 3 to 7 pounds in the first 1 to 2 weeks of any dietary change. That didn't mean that they lost 3 to 7 pounds of fat. It means they probably lost or redistributed 3 to 7 pounds of fluid. And so you're not going to regain the fat right away. That's going to take you a little time. You're going to have to fill up your glycogen tank first and then overflow it to fat storage. But if you maintain a healthy dietary consideration with good exercise and good mobility, you're not going to overflow your fat storage. You may get some bogginess in your muscles. You may even get some muscular hypertrophy appearance, but you haven't overflowed it.
Good explanation. I love how simply you explain it so we can understand. Thank you for doing that. My second caveat question there is then, if we were eating in a caloric deficit with the intention to lose body fat, I know many women especially get this idea that it's all or nothing, that if they have the one little piece of chocolate or they eat the sucker or have half the donut, that they've ruined it all, and then they tend to psychologically tailspin and throw the day away, if you will, and either begin again tomorrow or Monday or the next month. What I'm curious to explore with you is, does it really damage us to the extent we've come to believe? Or if we're in a caloric deficit and our glycogen tank is not full, did that sugar really throw us off? What are your thoughts there?
I don't think the sugar threw you off, not as in terms of your glycogen reserve. But I think there's another factor. And so we have an issue, and so my specialty is interventional pain, dealing with obesity, dealing with addiction, and dealing with diabetes. I'm boarded in a couple different fields. And so part of my opinion on this has to do with the hedonic response, the response to pleasure. So a lot of food consumption is really about dopamine release and fulfilling some sort of central desire in your brain for that food. You had that little piece of chocolate. It's probably calorically meaningless. But what it does is it puts us on a slippery slope of dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, a sensation of happiness and wellness that's reinforced. And this is getting worse over time because addiction is really a loneliness problem more than anything else. And so once we have that little piece of chocolate with that dopamine release, that's a different issue than filling our glycogen reserves because it's calorically meaningless. And so that's one issue. The second is, so one, it could be an addiction issue, food addiction, and the dopamine release associated with it, which then puts us on the slippery slope downward. The second issue is frequently I find that patients consume that little piece of chocolate and they go, well, I want to make sure this doesn't have any calories in it or any carbohydrates, so I'm going to get something with an artificial sweetener. That's a bigger problem. That artificial sweetener causes an immediate insulin dump as soon as it touches your tongue because your pancreas goes, hey, I'm about to get sugar. And so it dumps out a bunch of insulin. The insulin goes into your bloodstream, shoves what glucose you have into your cells, and at the same time shoves extra glucose, whatever it can find, into your muscle and stores it as fat. So that's one. And then the second thing is that little bit of artificial sweetener changes your gut bacteria and makes the bacteria more efficient. It leaves a population of bacteria that is more efficient at absorbing sugar later. You change your gut bacteria profile about every few hours. And so if in between morning to mid-morning to noon if you took a picture of your gut bacteria, they're constantly changing. And they're changing in a circadian rhythm. And it's like a giant fight in your intestines of who's going to survive and what groups and who's going to take over. It's a battle royale in your stomach, in your intestines. And so they're constantly trying to figure out who's going to be in charge. And that little bit of stimulus of artificial sugars, especially some of the artificial sugars that we've developed, the historical ones, they typically will promote one bacteria over another. And what happens is some of the ones that they promote create more efficiency in their absorption. So as you absorb your next set of meals, your absorption becomes more efficient. And as you become more efficient, you gain more weight for the same amount of calorie. And so I hope that wasn't too long-winded of an explanation, but it's a very complicated mess. And it's the balance between your gut bacteria, what it wants to do, your insulin level, and your biological homeostasis, and what your brain wants. It's a constant battle between all of these.
I think you explained it very well, and especially following what you talked about at the beginning of our interview, which was about the efficiency and the inefficiency and which one we wanted. So I think that made perfect sense. But do you really believe that food or sugar addiction is a thing? I've heard both sides of the coin argued that this is all just made up and an excuse for us, and then other sides of the debate are saying, no, this is biologically a thing. Where do you stand on that?
There's a beautiful study that was just recently done on mini pigs, where they looked at the dopamine receptors, and it was it was a study done in Science. It was sucrose intake lowers mu opioid and dopamine D2 D3 receptor availability. That's the study. It's by Winterdahl, and what they did was they did these little mini pigs, and they looked at what activation happens in the brain with sugar. And it's the same activation that you get, exactly the same location. This was done by PET scan, and it's the same activation that you get to fentanyl or carfentanil, which is a synthetic opioid. Whether it's the blood sugar that you're getting or it's the opioid, it activates the same receptor for addiction. So I believe that there is something significant to it. Now, it's not that clear, but I can tell you that if this was not the case, we wouldn't have sugar-sweetened beverages that are made hyper-palatable by changing the amount of fructose. And here's what I mean by that. So if you take table sugar, it has a 1-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose. But if you look at what we have in our sugar-sweetened beverages, they're fructose enhanced. And one might ask why. Fructose more avidly activates the nucleus accumbens and the dopamine sensitization there than does glucose. So the sugar companies, the companies that sell beverages, add extra fructose specifically because they want to get people to buy more stuff.
Right.
And so it's not the hardcore addiction that you're going to have somebody thinking that, oh my God, I'm going to die without this. But there is a sensation of tranquility and pleasure associated with stimulating that dopamine receptor. And we know that that's the case. The studies have shown it on PET scan. So it's not something that we can really conjecture anymore.
That is very, very interesting. Thank you for your input on that. So I'm curious about when patients come in and you're doing certain types of tests, what your opinions are. I'm curious about any patients who present with normal blood glucose, but maybe that's not a sign of there being in optimal health. Can you explain how that's possible?
Yeah, it's the blood glucose is what your body displays for you. Your bloodstream really can't hold more than about a half, maybe a teaspoon of sugar total. It may be 15 grams, 20 grams at any given time is what your entire bloodstream holds. So the sugar that you measure in your bloodstream is not necessarily a specific way to look at that blood sugar. The more important thing that I look at is insulin levels. Insulin is the driver. It's telling you what's actually going on with your endocrine system. You will not get a rise in blood sugar until you are quite far along on insulin resistance. And in fact, so your normal blood glucose will be 80, 85, 90, 95, even 100. But your insulin level is already going up. Your insulin level starts to go up around a glucose continuously of about 90, which is a hemoglobin A1C of about 5.5. By the time that we get you to a diagnosis of prediabetes and you've already got microvascular damage, your insulin level is pretty high. It's probably in its 20s or 30s, and your hemoglobin A1C will be about 5.7, and your sugar might still only be 95 to 100. Your insulin is used to drive your sugar down. The early indication of becoming pre-diabetic and metabolically unhealthy is your insulin level. By the time that your sugar stays high, your insulin level is going into beta cell depletion, and your insulin level is having a difficult time catching up to your sugar, and you've already sustained significant metabolic damage. Metabolic damage starts at a hemoglobin A1C about 5.6, 5.7. And, that's a blood sugar of about 100. And you're already damaging it. And you're not going to know it unless you measure the insulin. And I find that most physicians don't know this. They measure glucose. They go, oh, your fasting glucose is 100. You're fine. You're good. But what's the insulin? If the insulin is 25 and your fasting glucose is 100, you have a problem. Your insulin should be 4, 3. It should be tiny. It should be a very minuscule dose. And so
is insulin
I focus in on that insulin level first.
Okay. Is insulin something that only a doctor can check? Because we have glucometers that we can buy at a pharmacy and check our own blood sugar, but is it possible for us to do a home test to check our own insulin, or should we go into our doctors for that?
So a lot of labs will do that for you. A lot of independent labs will do an insulin level for you. And typically I find that if you're going to a private lab, you can get a full spectrum of information, looking at all these funny biomarkers that are important. An insulin level should probably only cost you about $25 to check. The poor man's insulin If I wanted to check what my insulin level is today, I check my ketones, because if my insulin level is low, my ketones go up naturally. If my insulin level is high, I don't have any ketones. And so there's a direct relationship between insulin level and ketones. And so the easiest way to tell if your insulin level is high or low is, do you have any ketones? If your ketones are 0.3 to 0.5, you have very low insulin. That doesn't mean that you have therapeutic ketosis, but you don't have any insulin that's circulating high, and that probably means that your blood glucoses are pretty low. And that's for a regular human being that's not a type 1 diabetic. Type 1 diabetics, totally different physiology. But I use ketones as a quick measure, whether I'm using exhaled ketones, looking at acetone, or I'm doing a Keto Mojo or something like that, doing a finger stick. There's a whole variety of measurements that you can do. And, you know, one thing I will mention, just a hack that people don't realize, we always think that, you know, you're going to eat the sugar and you have to burn it. When you're doing more ketosis, a good 20 to 30% of the sugar or the carbohydrate that you've got in your system or the ketone that you've got in your system is being exhaled as acetone. And so you're not even having to exercise acetone off. It's coming right off your breath. You can usually smell it. People talk about ketone breath. That's actually carbohydrate that's off-gassing that you didn't have to put through your kidneys and you didn't have to exercise off. It's a little hack that people don't realize. They're burning calories just by breathing, and they're exhaling acetone, which is a carbohydrate. And that's the smell that people sometimes go, oh, I have a tinny smell in my mouth.
Right.
That's that acetone that's burning off. And that's what we measure when we do exhaled ketone measurements.
Okay, the last question, which is partial, several questions entwined in one, that I want to go the direction, because you are treating patients for the reversal of type 2 diabetes and the management of obesity, which is very apparent in your extensive knowledge here that you've shared with us today. So if somebody listening to this had type 2 diabetes, my first question is, do you believe they have the power to reverse that? And secondly, if the answer is yes, what are maybe your top 2 or 3 pieces of advice for that individual?
For type 2 diabetes, as long as your body makes insulin, it's fully reversible. And, you know, and the way that you do that, so insulin is a protein. It's a peptide. And when it's released from your pancreas, from your beta cells, there's 2 elements to it. One is the insulin, and the other is the C-peptide. The C-peptide is sheared off of the insulin peptide. And the reason why I'm telling you this is, so if you're a type 2 diabetic, you're giving yourself insulin if you're bad enough. And so if I measured your insulin level is going to be high. But that doesn't tell me what capacity you have to make insulin. So instead what you do is you measure their C-peptide. The C-peptide tells me what their insulin production capacity is. And if they have insulin production capacity, I can usually reverse their diabetes. If they have no insulin production capacity, if their C-peptide is zip, they're essentially a type 1 diabetic. They're not producing any insulin. They've converted from a type 2, and they may have had an autoimmune dysfunction or something else, and they now have a type of adult type 1 diabetes that converted. They've just extinguished their beta cells. And so those patients, I can't use dietary means to get them back very effectively. If they're producing C-peptide, though, almost always we can make some very significant changes. My average patient reduces insulin dose by about 5 to 6 days into wow. treatment, and 75 to 80% of them are off of insulin within a month, as long wow. as they're producing C-peptide. But they have to be producing C-peptide, and that's a critical element. And so that's the first thing I measure is C-peptide, insulin, hemoglobin A1C, fructosamine. Fructosamine is a measure of fructose binding, as opposed to hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of glucose binding. And it gives me a pretty good idea of where they are in their beta cell. And if they've got C-peptide, I can almost always reverse them. And if they don't have C-peptides, then you're not going to be able to reverse them by diet alone. It's going to take a lot more.
Okay, wonderful explanation. So if somebody then was producing insulin, what would be the best thing for them to begin doing today, assuming that they were doing absolutely nothing to care for themselves and they were just starting from a blank piece of paper? What would you have them start doing as most important?
So the first thing that we do is we get all their metrics and we figure out where are we starting. And we want to make sure that they're stable to be able to adapt to a lifestyle change. And so for some patients, and typically most of my patients that are type 2 diabetics, 90% of them are significantly overweight. But 10% of them are not. 10% of them are quite thin, and they're type 2 diabetics. And that distinguishes the kind of issue that we're dealing with. The thin patients that are type 2 diabetics are typically patients that, in my population, are typically Asian patients that have a ton of exposure to vegetable oil, and their livers are congested with vegetable oil. So depending upon which thing I'm dealing with, I will approach it with a change in the oil that they eat and going away from omega-6 vegetable oil or industrial seed oils and convert over to omega-3s. I'll supplement them with omega-3s to a very high level and eliminate their consumption of omega-6s, which is an easy substitute. Going to olive oil, going to butter, going to lard and natural fats, as opposed to using canola or mazola or some of the other oils. I'll convert them over. That's the easy thing. Then what I'll have them do is start by skipping breakfast. I want to get them to the point where they're doing a shorter eating window. And I find that that's much easier to do for my patients. So I get them to start skipping breakfast and start their first meal about 11 and get their last meal in around 6. And I get a longer window where they're not eating. So I start to pull stuff out of their liver. I start to pull the glycogen reserve out. And then we start with satiating food. If I can't give them satiating food, they're going to be hungry all the time. So I want them to eat to satiety. And satiety is driven primarily by fat content and protein content. If you have a decent amount of protein and a decent amount of fat, you're going to have pretty good satiety for a prolonged period of time. And so we have a couple different protocols that we use, and they're freely available. I mean, we have all of this on our website, and it's freely available. We push them toward having satiating meals and getting good food. And I deal with indigent patients in an urban environment. I practice in the urban core, so a lot of my patients don't have much money. So they figure out how to get a high-quality protein and high-quality fat on practically no money. And so that's the next component. At the same time, we start to augment their sleep. Sleep is as important as being awake. Sleep is the time period when your body rests. But if you have a distorted sleep pattern, you're going to have an incredibly high cortisol. And the higher your cortisol is, one, you're going to be more awake, and you have more time period that you're going to eat. And two, you're going to hold on to fluid, and you're going to hold on to other things, and your anxiety level is going to be high. And so it's I try to get them to sleep better. And we have a whole sleep ritual that we go through: a cold, dark room with usually some sort of noise, avoidance of all caffeine for at least 4 hours before bed, and typically 6 to 8 hours before bed. And we do everything we can to improve their sleep hygiene. No blue screens, no TV screens for a couple hours before bed, creating a ritual around their sleep. And so for us, sleep is as important as being awake. And so we have these series of steps. And then the next thing that we typically do is we have them simply start walking. A lot of my patients can't exercise because, they're coming in, they might weigh 450 pounds. They can't move. So we start with the simple stuff. Do what you can, and after every meal, we want you to move for 5 or 10 minutes. And some of them start off being able to walk 5 steps. And for them, that's a 10 out of 10 exercise at first. And eventually, a year later, they're walking 20, 30 blocks. They're walking a significant amount. Every time that they put something in their mouth, we encourage them to use their quadricep muscles and mobilize those quads and do everything they can to expend a little bit of energy. I hope that wasn't too long of an answer, but that's kind of the process.
No, that's a very realistic checklist, and I would assume if I were in that position, I'd be feeling a lot of hope because that sounds doable. It doesn't sound extreme.
There's nothing extraordinary. I mean, there's nothing. Yeah. Weight loss is complicated, but it's not. It's what's happened is that our society and our culture and our big food and big pharma and governmental subsidies, it's conspiring against us. It's not purposefully doing that. It just is what it is. I don't think anybody has this grand plan of, I'm going to make America, super, super obese and diabetic, even though, our diabetes and obesity levels are going up. I don't think it's a grand plan. I think it's the result of just historically primitive efficiency in our metabolism and our ability to store fat impacted by all of this, all of the easy access to high quality food that we've never had before. It's so ultra refined that it goes, it's like gigantic sugar bombs where we never expected them.
Isn't that the truth? Oh, I could pick your brain for hours more. Unfortunately, we do have to end today, but I want to give our listeners a place to reach out to you in the event that they would like to either work with you or have any other thing. I know that on your website you have a Reversing Diabetes Guide that is a free download. I will put that in the show notes, but where's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
That website is probably the easiest way. I welcome questions. If anybody has any questions, if anybody has any thoughts, the website is probably the easiest. I'm also on Instagram. I do about 1.5 million of free care a year for indigent patients in the urban core. And my real goal is to change our approach to this metabolic dysfunction that we have. And I'm really trying to make as big of an impact to help patients, to help the community. And so if somebody has a particular question, I usually can answer it in a few hours. I run a busy practice. We don't charge for our coaching. We provide the resources. There's a ton of videos on there that kind of go through some of this stuff. And we produce a lot of in-house graphics so that it makes it more understandable for people. And that's typically the place to reach out to me.
Wonderful. So we will definitely have that link in the show notes. If anybody listening to this is in Missouri, he's been practicing in St. Louis, and you can get that information by going to his website. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Padda. We appreciate your knowledge, your generosity in sharing this with us, and the care you give to all of your patients. What a lifetime of service and legacy you're leaving behind. So thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.